Okay, so I gotta fix my slide before I said there was about 30 times more um, oxygen available in the air than in the water. I have a typo there or something. So when water is saturated, it has something like 10 parts per million oxygen. The air we breathe has something like 200 times, 200,000 parts per million oxygen. So a fairly massive difference between the two. And this is why there are no endotherms with gills. They just can't get enough oxygen out of the water to run endothermy. But that aside, we mentioned how bird lungs were the most efficient lungs, but the most efficient respiratory organ are those fish gills with that counter-current exchange. But bear in mind, if they come out of the water, even though there's tons of atmospheric oxygen, they still choke to death, basically. They suffocate because their gills collapse and they lose all of that efficiency. And they dehydrate, of course, which prevents gas exchange. Okay. So, we've seen bird lungs and fish gills. Fish gills have counter-current exchange that makes them very good at pulling oxygen out of the water. Bird lungs have a single direction of flow. Air comes into one side of the lungs and out the other side of the lungs, and there's always fresh air going through the lungs, so they are able to extract tons of oxygen from the air, so when they're flying, they don't run into problems. Now, human lungs don't work like that. We have a tube that goes into our lungs, air comes into that tube and out of that same tube. We don't have a pipeline like birds do, where air comes in one side and out the other side. So if we look at this human being here, we can see they have their pharynx, that's their throat essentially, and then we have the esophagus, of course, which we've mentioned before, and then in front of that we have the trachea. The trachea is the tube that connects the pharynx to the lungs. So there's the trachea, which is a reinforced ridge tube here, which runs down and branches off into these two bronchi, or singular bronchus, which is these branches here, which then branch into even smaller tubes called bronchioles. So if you remember, we saw tracheoles in insects. Tracheole means little, like little bronchus. So we have the trachea, the bronchus, or bronchi for plural, and bronchioles, which are the little branches. And we can't see it, but at the end of the bronchioles are where the alveoli are. Okay, and then at the base of these lungs, where all these structures are, we have the diaphragm, the muscular diaphragm. So let me point out something your book mentions that you should be aware of. Animals like amphibians have lungs too, but they breathe with what we call a positive pressure breathing system, meaning they kind of force air down into their lungs by kind of swallowing it, almost like it's pushed into their lungs. We as humans, however, use a negative pressure breathing system, meaning that diaphragm will contract and it will expand the chest cavity, just like when you pull on the back of a syringe. It creates a vacuum within the chest cavity, and that draws air in. So air flows in because of the negative pressure in our system. So we see that in organisms that have a diaphragm. Okay, so what happens? Well, the diaphragm contracts, expands the chest cavity, creating a negative pressure situation. That causes air to flow into the mouth, into the pharynx, down the trachea. Air flows to the two bronchi. The bronchi lead to bronchioles. Now, I'm sorry the text moved here, but the bronchioles are covered with mucus. They are lined with mucus, and they have cilia that are twitching. Little hairy cilia, just like the exact same cilia that you saw in lab, if you were lucky enough to have lab this semester, where we looked at pond water and we saw the cilia on like the pond water organisms or the tetrahymena. Then, what's the purpose of that? Well, the cilia move that mucus up and out. So when you clear your throat, you know, that kind of hawking a loogie kind of a thing, that's when you have dirt and debris trapped in that mucus, and the cilia move that stuff up and out of your airway so it doesn't clog up your airway. Meanwhile, gas exchange is occurring at these thin, moist sacs called alveoli. Alveoli, like I said, are thin. They're wet because they're in your lungs, so you have to have a wet surface for gas exchange. And they're covered in capillaries, blood vessels, so that way your blood can exchange gases with the alveoli. The alveoli have 50 times the surface area of your outer skin. So if you were to take them all and lay them out flat, 50 times. And they're surrounded, of course, by capillaries. I think they claim that that your alveoli has about the same surface area as like a tennis court or something like that. It's crazy. So there is a human lung that's been kind of plasticized, and you can see all you can see the trachea, the two major bronchi, and then the bronchioles all branched out there, and at the tips of all those bronchioles would be the alveoli. So if we zoom in, here's a terminal bronchiole, meaning the smallest one at the end of the branch. They end in these air sacs, lots of air sacs here, called alveoli, and the alveoli are surrounded by capillaries. So oxygen-rich blood is leaving the lung, oxygen-poor blood is coming into the lung, diffusion takes place, CO2 is given off into the alveoli, oxygen is picked up from the alveoli, then the alveoli, release that CO2 back out when you exhale. Meanwhile, that oxygen-rich blood is flowing back to your body. Notice pulmonary arteries. We'll get to that later, but pulmonary arteries are the veins that bring oxygen-poor blood to your lungs, and pulmonary veins bring oxygen-rich blood back out to the body. Kind of an important concept. So, when you have stuff like this is pollen, like we looked at in lab. Once again, if you're in group A anyway, you saw pollen in lab. And this is dust, which is a lot of human skin cells and hair and stuff like that. That's what dust is often made of in our homes. This stuff gets trapped in our mucus, in our bronchioles, and those cilia in our lungs. Here's a picture of those cilia. Just like the cilia, the same structure as the cilia in a paramecium. Help to waft that stuff up and out of our lungs to help clear our airways. Now, if you smoke a lot, however, it paralyzes the ability for cilia to twitch, and you have an extra buildup of mucus in your lungs, and you end up with smoker's cough because you're always trying to clear that mucus out of your airway. All right, so we see where this diffusion takes place. I also want to mention now, let's bring it back to physiology and homeostasis. How do we control how much oxygen is in our blood? And that's where we'll pick up in the next video.